As we head up the Dee Valley from Aberdeen, we enter the ancient province of Mar when we cross the Bridge of Fuch at Banchory. In the 1950s, we might have been making our journey to Braemar on the Balogie bus, operated by Strachans, a Ballater company who ran a bus service up the South Deeside Road. The Earl of Aboyne erected a previous bridge across the River Dee here in 1828, which was very bad timing, as it was swept away in the Muckle Spate of 1829. Undeterred, he replaced it in 1831 with this fine suspension bridge, which was to stand for 40 years before it too was replaced. As we head west, we might have been impeded by slower traffic. This shot was probably taken in the 1930s. As we pass through Ballater, the square at the Glenmick Parish Church has stout wooden fencing on both sides of the road, and up ahead we can see the fences protecting the railway beyond Station Square. If we had avoided Ballater by going through the pass, we would have been struck by the almost total lack of tree cover. Abergeldy is the most westerly of the Gordon castles on Deeside, where the laird's support for Bonnie Dundee in the 17th century led to the castle being captured and garrisoned by General Mackay, a situation not to be tolerated by the Farquharsons, who promptly blockaded it. Just short of Inver, below us on the river bank, lies Cairn-y-Queen, where the clan Farquharson mustered their men for battle. Each man left a stone on the cairn and removed it when he returned. The stones which remained marked the number of those who had died. As we approach Braemar, we come to the Castle of Braemar, which was built in 1628 by James Erskine, Earl of Mar. It was burned in 1689 by the Black Colonel to deprive the Hanoverians of its use, but it was rebuilt in 1748, after which it was leased to the government as a military barracks. In Braemar, the road pattern has not changed since 1866. We see that the Auchendrine Inn has already become the Fife Arms Hotel, and the Invercald Hotel is also established. Also marked on the map are 3 churches and 3 schools, a sawmill, a meal mill, a smithy, and a post office. The meal mill has stood here on the bank of the Cluny Water since 1790. It is now a dwelling house. In the centre of Braemar, on the east side of the River Cluny, is the site of Kindrochit Castle. Prior to 1390, there was probably a building of timber construction on this site, which was used as a hunting lodge by Robert II. In 1390, Sir Malcolm Drummond, husband of Isabella, Countess of Mar, received a licence to build a tower at Kindrochit. On the first floor there was a kitchen and a hall with a spiral staircase to the floors above. Kindrochit Castle is an exceptionally grand and powerful example of a 14th century castle, consisting of an oblong tower house or keep, to which is appended a barmkin or courtyard, enclosed by curtain walls defended by flanking towers. It is strongly situated on the east brink of a rocky gorge on the Cluny Water, with an ancient mill laid on the other side. A bridge across the Cluny Water led directly into the castle courtyard. The castle fell into decay in the first half of the 16th century. The Great North of Scotland Railway Company was the first to operate buses to Braemar, which terminated at their bus depot, which opened in 1904. The bus in the picture is a Milnes Daimler, delivered in 1904 to operate the pioneer service. I do not know how they cleared snow off the roads in the late 1800s, although this looks like it might have been shuffled. But the snow was enough to beat some of the early omnibus services, and here a broken down bus is towed into Braemar by horses in a snowstorm. It was not just the buses that had trouble with the snow, and the Braemar postie had an innovative solution to the problem. Braemar holds the record for the lowest temperature recorded in Britain at minus 27.2 degrees centigrade, and because of the surrounding hills, the maximum possible sunshine on a midwinter day is 3.5 hours. James Downey, who lived from 1850 to 1929, was a mountain guide in Braemar. Since the early 1800s, Braemar has been popular with mountaineers, and guides with sure-footed ponies for hill climbing were in great demand. Making butter at the Invercalled Hotel. A few local tradespeople formed a society to meet for the occasional social evening, which in 1816 became the Braemar Rights Friendly Society. In 1823, the Earl of Fife became patron, and in 1826 it changed its name to the Braemar Highland Society, and in 1866 to the Royal Braemar Highland Society. The first athletic competitions took place in 1832, and Queen Victoria first attended the Games in 1848. There are 181 men in this picture. In 1855, 150 officers and men of the Forbes Highlanders from Donside marched to the Braemar gathering, where they camped at Corrymalsey as the guests of James Duff, the 5th Earl of Fife, who provided 3 fine stags for the men's dinner and an ample supply of whisky. Sir Charles Forbes, with the Master of Duff at his shoulder, introduces him to the Lonich men. Sir Charles Forbes is showing Lady Agnes Duff the henchman's sword. The substantial facilities required to roast 3 stags for the men's dinner. The Clan Forbes marched to the Games with their friends the Clan Macduff, both clans headed by their colours and their pipes. After the Games, the officers were invited to dinner at Invercalled, and in the evening the men were marched to Corrymalsey, and the night was passed at a ball given by Mr. and Lady Agnes Duff. Prior to 1906, the Games were held at several different locations, including Cluny Park at Invercalled House, Mar Lodge and Braemar Castle. At the invitation of Queen Victoria, the Games were held at Balmoral Castle on 4 occasions, including 1898, when this photograph was taken. In 1906, the late Duke of Fife gave to the Royal Braemar Highland Society about 12 acres of ground to be laid out as a park in which to hold the gathering. As we leave Braemar and head up the Linn of Dee road, we will pass the Mill of Coole, Arderg, Althaclair, Corrymalsey with its linn and home of the Duke of Fife, the Hanging Tree, and Muildarach, before we come to Invereye village. As we head up the Linn of Dee road, in about half a mile we pass the Mill of Coole, where in 1747 the miller was Donald Lamont, who we will meet again later. Here a track ran down to the timber ford. My grandfather was feed to Allanacoich Farm as a young man in the late 1800s, and he told how the box on a box cart just sat on the axle and was not fixed to it. When crossing the timber ford when the river was running high, the box could float off and you left your wheels and axle behind. The old house of Arderg lies on the flat ground down beside the River Dee, immediately below a lay-by, 2 miles from Braemar. You can see the remains of 2 buildings on the right bank of the stream, just beside the plank bridge. In the late 1700s, because there was still persecution of Catholics taking place in Braemar, the Catholic priest, Father Charles Farquharson, lived here. He was a brother of the then Farquharson of Invereye. Nearby can be seen a flat stone with his name and the date 1785 carved upon it. Half a mile further on, below the next lay-by, lies the old farm of Althaclair, and in 1942, as we can see, the house, barn and enclosures were all still reasonably intact. Robert Lamont, who at the age of 2 was evicted from Dalnavay Farm in Gleneye with his parents and 5 siblings, was living here in 1897 when he married my grandmother's first cousin, Catherine Thompson. Robert was a gardener at Mar Lodge, and he was one of the Piper Lamonts who gave their name to Piper's Wood in Gleneye. Looking down the Corrimalsey burn to the road bridge, which was widened in 1983, the old stables of Corrimalsey Cottage are on the left of the picture, and just beyond them was situated Corrimalsey Cottage, at one time the home of the Duke of Fife, which we have already looked at in part 1 of this presentation. We pass the Victoria Bridge, and on the left at the next bend is the Hanging Tree. The hanging of a lament of Inverrigh by the Farquharsons in the 17th century has already been mentioned. This is the tree where the deed was done. The victim's mother cursed his killers, prophesying that the tree her son was hanged on would still be fresh and green when there were no Farquharsons left on Deeside. The prophecy did come true, as the male line of the Invercall Farquharsons failed in 1805, and the tree did not die until 1920. In 1920, the gallows tree fell down, and the Duchess of Fife ordered that it should be made into a bench. Not a lady to easily change her mind, she was later persuaded that it should be re-erected. It stands to this day, but now in a very decrepit state, held up by 4 wire stays. As we enter Inverrigh village, the first house that we come to is Meildarach Cottage, where lived John Lamont, taxidermist to the Duke of Fife for over 50 years. The pink building beyond was his workshop. The locals had very little respect for the dignity of the ancient craft of taxidermy. John Lamont, the taxidermist, was known locally as the Stuffer, and this was known as the Stuffer's house. The workshop had been allowed to decay into a perilous condition over many years. Its poor condition was even more evident from the rear. But it has now been restored to its former glory and is used as a holiday home. Here we have a bill to the Duke of Fife dated 1872 from Alexander Mitchell of Aberdeen, bird stuffer, for the supply of 1 pair stag's eyes, 6 weeks teaching stuffing to John Lamond, supply of stuffing material for 3 stag's heads, 2 white hares, 7 grouse, 4 ptarmigan, and 1 black cock. Agricultural reform came to Meikle Inverrigh in 1799, when all of the tenants were evicted and the old system of run-rig farming ceased. An entirely new set of tenants was installed in 1803 in the consolidated units shown on this map. However, the new tenants continued to practice the system of transhumance farming until the 1830s, with the cattle being taken up to the summer sheelings. The part of Inverrigh on the east side of the River Eye is known as Meikle Inverrigh. In 1841, the population of the village was 137, living in a total of 39 houses, and there were houses on both sides of the road. There were 26 farmers or farm labourers, 6 wrights, and a weaver, a tailor, a diker, a contractor, a miller, and a sawyer. By 1881, the population of the village had fallen to 98, and all of the houses on the south side of the road had fallen into ruin. Deer stalking had arrived on the Braes of Mar, as occupations now included gamekeepers, estate workers, and a taxidermist. This photograph probably dates from before 1893, and the houses in the picture are from the left, the Mains of Inverrigh, at that time was still a thatched cottage, and beyond it we can see Albany, the old schoolhouse, Thistle Cottage and Hawthorn Cottage. This is a slightly later photograph, as all of the houses now have slated roofs, so this picture dates from just after 1893. The half house on the left edge is the Mains of Inverrigh, now with its new roof. Notice Mar Lodge in the background. Thistle Cottage was the home of Maggie Brewer, who ran a renowned bothy here for climbers until she died in 1939. Thistle Cottage was not big, but it was often said that it had elastic walls. No one arriving here was ever turned away. Maggie provided bed and breakfast for 1 shilling, 5p in today's money, and her tea and scones were legendary. She also ran dances in her barn, with John Morgan, the postman, providing the music on his fiddle. This was the Church of Scotland's Assembly School, which had been on this site from at least 1869, but possibly as early as 1789. In 1850, the school had 16 scholars, but there were only 11 pupils when it closed in 1917. The legendary keeper at Derry Lodge, Bob Scott, at the age of 11 years, is second from the right. The girl on the right is his big sister, Nora Patricia Scott, then aged 13 years. Their little brother Walter, then aged 10, is listed as absent. Their parents, Donald Scott and Elizabeth Burney, had 11 children, and these were the youngest 3 of them. John Lamont received his early education in Inverrigh, and in 1817, to continue it, he went to a Scottish seminary in Ratisbon in Bavaria. There he was known as Johann von Lamont. He became a distinguished astronomer with a worldwide reputation, and the Astronomer Royal of Bavaria, and was created a Knight of the Order of Merit. This memorial was erected by the Deeside Field Club and was unveiled by Her Royal Highness Duchess of Fife in 1934. Before we cross the River Eye, we will have a trip up the once inhabited but now empty Glen Eye. The track leaves the main road opposite the Mains, and there are several places of interest at the bottom of the glen. The Knock, Inverrigh House, Loyna Veich, the Mill of Inverrigh, Ricardo's Bridge, and the Falls of Connie. Up the tributaries of the Connie and the Christie lie the site of an illicit still and Sergeant Davies' grave. A little further on up the River Eye, we pass the Colonel's Bed before we arrive at the old gamekeeper's house at Acheri. In a short distance we pass the Knock, which was the old gamekeeper's house. Glen Eye, or most of it, has always been part of the estate of Inverrigh. Captain Alexander Ramsay succeeded to the Mar estates on the death of his aunt in 1959, but in order to pay the death duties, he had to sell the part of the estate north of the River Dee, which of course included Mar Lodge. For the second time in history, the Duff family were left without a home on their estate on the south side of the River Dee, and to rectify that, Captain Ramsay built Inverrigh House in 1984. On the west side of the River Eye stands the keeper's house at Loyna Veich. This picture was taken in 1980, and the cottage has since been replaced by a modern bungalow. When the Farquharsons first acquired the estate, there would probably have been some tenants in the lower part of Glen Eye. The middle part of the glen was used as summer pastures by the tenants of Inverrigh and Corrymalsey. The upper part of the glen, then called the Glen of Altenauer, was part of the reserved forest. During the time the Farquharsons were in charge of the estate, the arable area of the glen was greatly extended. The mill of Inverrigh was situated on the bank of the River Eye, just beyond the lock gate at the entrance to the glen, and the miller's house a little further on, below the Drystane dyke, close to the road. Little remains of the mill itself, but the course of the mill lade can be clearly seen travelling in a southerly direction away from the mill. In 1706, the miller was James Harrow, and from 1734 to 1773, the mill was run by a family called Downey. From 1810, the mill was run by Arthur Dingwall, a founding member of the Braemar Rights Friendly Society, whose descendants ran the mill until its demise. In 1841, a bridle road was constructed through the Glen of Christie, which was connected to the Glen Eye track by a footbridge. This bridge became known as Ricardo's Bridge, named after John Lewis Ricardo, an MP and a member of the Duff family. This photo predates the Second World War, when the bridge was crudely widened to facilitate extraction of timber from Glen Connie. Just above Ricardo's Bridge, the Connie Burn joins the River Eye on its west bank, and here lies the Falls of Connie, where happened the first recorded hill-walking accident in the Cairngorms. In 1858, William Roger had gone for a hill walk in Glen Eye with his older brother George, when he slipped and fell into the Falls of Connie and was drowned. Further up the River Connie is what is described as the site of an illicit still. I'm not sure if this is where this bottle was made. stone at the head of the valley of the River Christy marks the grave of Sergeant Arthur Davies of General Guise's regiment, who was stationed during the summer of 1749 with a detachment of men at Dubrach in Glendee. Two local men, Duncan Clark of Dalrun Duchlat in Gleneye and Alexander Bain MacDonald of Allanacoich, were accused of his murder, but the Crown was not able to prove their guilt. Continuing up Gleneye, we come to the Colonel's Bed. The Black Colonel is said to have successfully hidden at the bottom of this gorge after the Battle of Killiecrankie to avoid capture by the Redcoats. Due to a rockfall, there is now no easy access to this place. The two prominent ruins which can be seen today at Acheri are gamekeepers' houses built about 1843. No trace remains of the dwellings of the former farming community that lived here in 1752, when Duncan Shaw and Donald Downey were the tenants. From around 1815, there was only one tenant, an Angus MacDonald, whose son Charles took over sometime in the 1830s. Gleneye provides us with an excellent example of the economics of the Highland clearances. In 1842, the total annual rental income from all of the tenant farmers in Gleneye was £72, whereas the Duke of Leeds was paying £1,200 per annum for the lease of the shootings on the north side of the River Dee. So turning the part of the estate on the south side of the River Dee into a deer forest had very obvious economic potential for the landowner. And what is more, shooting tenants were not inclined to steal timber from the laird's forests or poach his wildlife. As a result, in 1842, the glen was cleared of tenant farmers. 5 gamekeepers have lived successively in the purpose-built gamekeeper's house at Acheri, starting with William Lamont in 1843 and ending with George Mitchell, who left in 1921. When George Mitchell left, the glen was totally uninhabited. Leaving Acheri, the next settlement on the track is at Carnifay. However, the main farms in this stretch of the valley lie on the other bank at Dalruan Duchlat, Dalnafay and Altschlat. The tenants of Inverrye and Corrimalsey used to have their shealing grounds where these 3 farms were later to be established. Beyond the flat ground of the meadow of Gleneye lies the ruins of Altenhour Lodge at the end of the track up the glen. Although there are several ruins at Carnifay and a cornkill, there is not much evidence of improved land. A William Grant lived here between 1767 and 1773, but no other evidence of occupation has been found. At Dalrun Duchlat there are 8 separate buildings, including a dwelling house, barn, stable, byre and cart shed. The ground here is remarkably clear of stones. Apart from the cart shed, which had a wide door, it is impossible to distinguish which building was which. On the hillside above, there is a ditch running horizontally to drain water away from the cultivated area, which still performs its function fairly well today. Nothing is known of the original tenants, but between 1752 and 1769, Duncan Clark lived here. Malcolm and William Lamont came to Dalruan Duchlat in the early 1800s, but from 1824 onwards it was farmed by William Lamont on his own. The ruins are less extensive at Dalnafay than at Dalruan Duchlat, but there was a house, barn, stable, byre, cotter house and sheepcote and a well-preserved kiln. John Shaw lived here in 1752 and remained for at least 40 years. Donald Lamont was the tenant from the early 1800s, and he was one of the Piper Lamonts that gave their name to Piper's Wood. We've already met his son Robert Lamont, who was living in Altaclair in Glendee when he married in 1897. The remains of the lime kiln at Dalnafay. Here we see the house and enclosure at Altschlat, which was situated on the south bank of the burn with the same name. There was also a barn and 2 byres. The house had a flagstone paved floor, part of which remains visible. The tenant in 1752 was John Grant, who was followed by William MacDonald in 1773. From 1808, the farm was occupied by Macintoshes. The extensive area of flat land which extends to the south of this point to almost as far as Altonour was called the Meadow of Gleneye. Presumably this is where the Farquharsons of Inverary grazed their cattle in the summer. Altonour Cottage was built by the Earl of Fife in 1838, and a plantation of pine trees established around it to provide shelter. In 1844 it got a slated roof, and in 1868 a deer larder, coach house and dairy were also added. It was probably only used during the shooting season, and like a Kerry, it remained intact until the early 1960s when its roof was removed by the estate. In the 1950s, before the roof was taken off, the ruins were used as a bothy by climbers, and there was always a plentiful supply of wood for the fire. During our travels through Inverary and Gleneye, we have met 4 different Lamont families, and it will be no surprise to discover that they were all related. It is interesting to speculate on whether or not the family is descended from the original Lamonts that occupied the Inverary estate prior to 1622. This is Donald Lamont, who was the miller at the Mill of Coole in 1747, the progenitor of all the Inverary Lamonts. And this is his great-great-grandson, John Lamont, who was taxidermist to the Duke of Fife for over 50 years. And this is his son, John Lamont, who was in the photo of the staff taken at Mar Lodge in 1930. John had to suffer for being the taxidermist's son, as locally he was known as Jockey Stuffer. This is John Lamont, who as Johann von Lamont became the professor of astronomy at Munich University. This is Donald Lamont, who was evicted in 1842 from Dalnafay Farm in Gleneye with his wife and 6 children. This is his son Robert, who was 2 years old at the time of the eviction. This is my grandmother's first cousin, Catherine Thompson. And this is John Morgan, the postie at Inverary, who played the fiddle at Maggie Greer's dances. John cycled to Derry Lodge every day with the mail. And we will meet this man very shortly. He is John Morgan, the teacher at the Catholic school in Inverary in 1822. The Morgan family are one of the few of the indigenous families still with a presence in the village of Braemar. We return to Glendee and cross over the River Eye Bridge to enter Little Inverary. As we near the Catholic school, we pass Tobermoor, or St Mary's Well, at the roadside. John Morgan, who we have just met, moved his Catholic school from Braemar to Inverary in 1822 because of religious persecution in Braemar. In 1884, this school had 28 pupils. In 1933, the school still had 18 pupils, but only 5 when it finally closed in 1947. My childhood memories start about the year 1950, and at that time most of the houses in Inverary were still occupied by an indigenous population of about 20 people. In 1954, the public electricity supply came to the village. Over the years, the road from Braemar has been widened and improved, and the woodland at Little Inverary, which was felled in the Second World War, was at last replanted in the early 1960s. The last 30 years or so have seen the decline in population continue. Ben Macdui and Derry Cairngorm now look down upon a village in which the small number of permanent residents are not descended from the original inhabitants. As we leave the village of Little Inverary, the last house on the right is Muir Cottage, a climbing hut belonging to the Cairngorm Club. The original cottage was sited on the other side of the road, but it was destroyed by fire in 1911, and the steading on the north side was converted into a dwelling house to replace it. From 1823 to 1827, there were 2 tenants listed for Muir of Inverary, an Alex MacDonald and a James Miller. In 1881, it was described as a farm of 6 acres arable. In 1950, the estate agreed to grant the Cairngorm Club a lease of the property, which they later bought before building the large extension at the rear, which was completed in July 1973. Prior to the Second World War, the UK imported 96% of its timber from abroad, a trade that could not be sustained in wartime. Canada sent 20 companies of soldiers to Scotland who were known as the Canadian Forestry Corps to exploit the homegrown timber resource. This map shows the location of all the Canadian camps as red dots, with number 25 being the camp at Inverrye. Here the logs are being fed onto the jack ladder, which hauled them up into the mill. The Canadian Forestry Corps felled the largest pine wood on the estate, historically called the Wood of Badness, that occupied the hill south of Little Inverrye. And here is the sawn lumber exiting at the other end of the mill. The Canadians built a wooden road bridge over the River Dee, across which a narrow gauge railway hauled the lumber from the mill to a loading bay on the south side of the Linn of Dee road. The Canadian Bridge was a well-known landmark in the area, and it was finally demolished in 1962 after having been damaged in a flood in 1956. The first bridge, built in the early 1800s over the Linn of Dee, was subsequently destroyed in the Mucklespate of 1829. A replacement bridge was built, which served until 1857. The current bridge, built in 1857, was opened by Queen Victoria. A triumphal arch was erected, at which the Queen said, "Lord Fife and Mr. Brooke received us, and walked near the carriage, pipers playing, the road lined with duff men. On the bridge Lady Fife received us, and we drank in whisky, prosperity to the bridge." In 1894, blasting work commenced at the Linn of Dee in an effort to ease the passage for salmon. This caused an outcry so great that the Duke of Fife ordered the operation to stop immediately. Fortunately, the works, so far as they had gone, improved the pass so much that fish were able to ascend with wonderful ease.